Welcome to another AP Macro Review video. My name is Matt Romano, coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia today. And today we are going to review the first few topics from Unit 2. Unit 2, I really like Unit 2. Unit 1 obviously is the general overview of economics, basic economic principles. It's a great introductory unit. It gets you started in the fundamentals of the field, introduces you to what economics is. And it's the same, well, not exactly, but very similar in both micro and macro. It's in Unit 2 that we really go into macroeconomics and we start looking at macro concepts and really distinguish the course from a general principles course or a micro course by looking at major macroeconomic indicators. So today, we're going to look at the circular flow model in GDP. We're going to talk about limitations to GDP. And then we're going to talk about unemployment, the unemployment rate in particular, as well as limitations to the unemployment rate. The way I view this, as I said, it's the beginning of really studying macroeconomics. I view it as what I call phase one. There are really three phases to learning macroeconomics. And phase one is what you're doing in this unit. You learn about the indicators. What indicators do I look for? And we need to know what that term means, first of all. I used to take it for granted that students knew what indicators meant. And at this stage, we're in review, you've done the whole course, you should know what it means, but these are markers of economic activity. And if we're going to be a part of this conversation, if we're going to keep up with the macroeconomy and understand what is happening in the globe and what's happening in our world and the news and what they're talking about in politics, we've got to know the language and we've got to know what to look for and where to look for them. So this is where we begin that. We look at the indicators that tell us something about economic activity. None of these indicators are perfect. What's important is that we understand what do they represent. And there's a tendency to rush into calculating because sometimes we get intimidated by calculations and we're worried about, can I do the numbers, especially on a test? And we want to be careful not to do that. We want to make sure that we understand the terminology first and then use the numbers to explain the terminology. And that's my biggest suggestion when it comes to dealing with these indicators. If you don't understand what GDP represents or unemployment represents, or in the next few days, inflation and real GDP per capita, if you don't know what those mean, the numbers are meaningless as well. And what's the point in calculating them? So let's spend some time on the definitional side. We're also going to look at calculating and make sure that we know how to calculate and we know what those numbers represent. We're going to look at real numbers, actual data for the United States, and we're going to look at some hypotheticals, more basic kind of simplified versions that you'll see on the exam and the type of calculations you should be required to do. So that's what it is. That's phase one. By the way, the other two phases, phase two is when we start to ask ourselves, why do these indicators fluctuate? What causes the fluctuations in GDP, unemployment, inflation? That's when you start getting into ADAS and the movement on the curves and why those things occur. And then phase three, as I look at it, is when we really get critical and say, okay, we know what these indicators are, we understand why they fluctuate, what do we do about it? And that's when you start getting into policy issues and extend yourself into long-term scenarios and then ultimately into international theory and what happens there. So those are the three phases as I view them for macro. I hope that maybe helps you as you're studying and consider where you are at different points. Today, we're going all the way back to phase one. Let's make sure we understand those indicators, what they mean, where to find them, and of course, how to calculate them and interpret them ultimately. All right, what do you need to know? Well, I just listed our learning objectives. We're going to refer back to those a lot today, the objectives and the skills that we want to develop throughout these three topics. And the first of those would be the circular flow in GDP. So the objective is to define how GDP is measured in its components. First and foremost, GDP is a measure of final output of an economy. That's the basic AP macro definition. Now, again, let's hammer that home and make sure we know what that means. What is GDP intending to measure? Because I think this is where a lot of people get confused and misinterpret GDP. GDP is exactly what this says. It's intending to measure production, how much was produced by an economy. And that's it. That's all it can measure. It doesn't measure our subjective well-being, which is the way economists say how happy we are. It doesn't measure, obviously does not measure income distribution. That's important that you know that. It doesn't measure income equality or inequality, wealth inequality. It doesn't get to any of that. Even per capita doesn't do that because it doesn't, and We'll talk about that later. It's purely a measure of output, how much output is generated by an economy. And it's important to keep that in mind. That's something that we'll talk about as we go further. That's something that AP Macro brings up. But even furthermore, it's something you need to know as you're looking at the world around you and you're analyzing data about the US GDP or other economies and their GDP. It's merely a measure of output. Even the determination of how to calculate that was debatable and cause of controversy back when these things were being developed, and have resulted in different methods for calculating GDP. It's a flow of income and expenditure, and we represent that with a circular flow diagram. So let's look at circular flow and look at the components, look at the parts first to make sure, again, we know what we're talking about, and then just briefly look at what exactly this thing is communicating. So we're going to do just a simple circular flow model today where we have two sectors of an economy. We have private households and private firms. Of course, you can expand the circular flow model to include government, to include financial sector, to include the rest of the world. Today, we're just going to focus on the simple circular flow model. So two sectors, households and firms, and we're looking at their interaction. They're interacting in two markets, product markets and factor markets. So again, defining households, private households, that's the private citizens out there living and working in the economy. The firms, those are the producers, the businesses, that's who's producing the final goods. So their interaction takes place in product markets, where there's the purchase and sale of final goods and services, and factor markets, where there's the employment of the factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And what circular flow is doing is, as an introductory model, is just making us think a little bit more about that flow of money and the flow of goods and services and the flow of factors of production through an economy. So what we have, as you're looking at it on the left-hand side, product markets, we have the interaction of households and firms and product markets. And what's happening is we as private citizens go to these product markets. You go to a restaurant or you go to a store and you purchase final goods and services. On this model, we want to represent the flow of money through product markets, and we do so like this. We see that the flow of money is going from households to firms in exchange for those final goods and services. Of course, we could add another arrow to show that, but I'm staying as simple as possible today and just representing money with our arrows. Now, circular flow means there's got to be a circle here somewhere. That money that's going into firms, in large part, and this is oversimplified, I know, but in large part is going to go back to households in the factor market as the firms are employing factors of production which are sourced by the households. In other words, where does land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship come from? Initially, it comes from households. So the arrows represent this flow of money, a circular flow of money that goes through an economy based upon basic product markets and factor markets. Is the economy more complex? Of course it is. There are more sectors, there are more markets, there's much more going on. But way back when you were in Unit 2 initially, and you were just this brand new AP Macro student, this was a good way to visualize how money flows through an economy and why money flows through the economy, that there are exchanges going on, and they're going on between sectors and within markets. So that's the purpose of the circular flow model. It's also a way of viewing GDP and understanding that the flow of money on either side of this flow chart is going to be equal. In other words, if we add it up, and think about this because you know what's coming next, if you added up all the money spent in product markets, what you're doing is you're adding up all the money spent on goods produced in this economy, domestically in this economy. If you added up the factor market, all the money spent in the factor market, what you're adding up is all the income that is earned within this economy by factors of production. Does that sound at all familiar? It should, because the next thing we're going to talk about are the different methods for calculating GDP. And essentially what I just did here with the circular flow model, what the circular flow model does is it describes that calculation process. And what I'm referring to is the expenditures approach and the income approach. So let's go there. Calculating nominal GDP. When you first saw that back in Unit 2, you had no idea what nominal meant. Of course, now you do, nominal versus real. We're not going to jump into real GDP today. We'll get to that another time. We're just going to talk about nominal. So we're talking about current dollar values and calculating output using current dollar values. How is this done? Well, there are three different methods for measuring GDP. The expenditures approach, which is what we're going to spend the majority of our time on today. This is what's used by national accounting methods, not entirely, but primarily in most communications, we're looking at the expenditures approach. And in most, I would say, test questions in AP, we're using the expenditures approach. Not all, don't think I said all, but in most, we are dealing with the expenditures approach. And what is that? The expenditures approach is how we calculate GDP, counting up all the money spent on domestically produced goods and services, subtracting any money spent on imported goods, because that, again, is the purchase of goods, but those goods weren't produced here. So to calculate that, you know this well, you're going to add up consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Consumption being essentially household spending on final goods and services. Investment spending, remind yourself what that is. That's primarily business spending. It can take on some different forms. It's just non-residential investment spending, which is spending on all kinds of capital items. It's residential investment spending, that's just the construction of new homes. And it's also additions to inventory. We sometimes forget that one. It's additions to inventory. Those are items that are produced in a year but not sold within that year. We still want to count those towards GDP, and that's where we fit them in as part of investment spending. The G stands for government purchases. Government spends a lot of money as well, and when they're purchasing goods or services through private business, we have to add those in. Keep in mind, we're only talking about government purchasing actual goods and services here. This does not include transfer payments because by definition, a transfer payment does not include the production of a good or a service. And ideally, when we're talking expenditures approach, if there's no production of a good or a service, it shouldn't count because there's nothing to count there. Net exports, again, finally, we've talked about that in the last couple of weeks. Net exports is merely exports minus imports. So we're going to add in all the money that comes in from exported goods, but we're going to subtract the money spent on imported goods. Okay, that's GDP using the expenditures approach. We're going to come back to that one a fair amount. We're going to practice that a fair amount today. The income approach, you don't hear quite as much about, but at least in theory, there's always statistical discrepancies. But in theory, the income approach would give you the exact same number as the expenditures approach as seen on the circular flow model. How do we calculate? We calculate GDP by counting up all income earned. And what is that? Well, go back to a couple of days ago, we talked about the factors of production and we talked about the income earned by the factors of production. That's rent, wages, interest, and profit. So you're adding up those four things, those four components, rent, wages, interest, and profit, and that will give you GDP, the same GDP that you would have gotten with the expenditures approach. Finally, there is the value added approach. We don't hear as much about this one, but again, it's worth mentioning. It's part of AP Macro. We need to know what this is. You're calculating GDP this time by moving along the steps of the production process and adding the value that is added from each step. In other words, this firm produced this and then it moved on to the next along the supply chain. And calculation-wise, it's simply the value of sales minus the cost of intermediate goods. And really the big takeaway here is that this value-added approach is where we understand the concept of excluding the value of intermediate goods. And it's worth taking a second to address why that is. So what are intermediate goods? Think of intermediate goods as being those that a producer purchases with the intent of using to produce another good that they're going to sell to you, ideally. So the example I like to use a lot of times, think of the auto industry and you know, pick your favorite auto manufacturer, your favorite car company. They're producing a car, they're manufacturing a car. And let's say they're doing it in the United States, it's going to count towards US GDP. Well, they're not manufacturing every single component of that automobile in-house. There are components of the automobile that they've got to purchase somewhere else, stick on the car before they sell to you. And I'm thinking tires, think about tires. So let's say they purchase tires from another firm in order to put it onto a car to sell to you. The purchase of those tires, that's an intermediate good. And if we counted that purchase of tires, the intermediate good, and counted the price of those tires as they're incorporated in the price of the automobile, those tires are being counted twice. And that would cause GDP to be valued as a much higher level, much higher value than it should be, because you're counting things twice. So the intent here, not counting intermediate goods, the intent is to not double count those products. So doing so, hopefully, at least that's the plan, the hope is that gives us a more accurate measure of what's actually being produced. Because if we're counting every set of tires twice, we're going to get a much higher GDP than we should. That's really one of the big takeaways from that value-added approach. That said, we are going to focus mostly on the expenditures approach and a little bit on the income approach. So back to the expenditures approach. What counts and what doesn't? I think it's important here to, again, like I started out with, remind yourself what GDP is, what GDP is intending to measure. GDP intends to measure what was produced this year in this country, whatever country we're talking about, within the political boundaries of this country. That's what it's trying to measure. It doesn't matter who produced it, just the simple fact that it was produced within this economy. We're talking expenditures approach. So again, we're talking consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. Your definition, there are a lot of definitions, but another way to rephrase the definition is to say that it's measuring domestically produced final goods and services. Final means they're being purchased by the final consumer of the good. They're not being purchased in order to put onto some other good and sell to you. So domestically produced final goods and services, including capital goods, new construction structures, and changes to inventory, like we just said, additions to inventory. One last note on domestically produced, and I want to point this out because, again, sometimes this can be confusing, and I've even seen it on AP exam questions. It doesn't matter if the firm producing is from the United States or not. Again, back to auto manufacturing. There are a lot of car companies from all over the world that have set up factories in the United States. I live in the South. I'm in Atlanta. There are a number of them throughout the Southeast here. Those are counted towards United States GDP. It doesn't matter who owns the company or where they're originally based out of. Those companies are operating in the United States. The goods are being produced in the United States. They count towards GDP. Done. What's not included? Well, we already mentioned intermediate goods and services. That makes sense because if you counted intermediate goods and services, now you're double counting a lot of products, and that's going to overestimate GDP. Used goods, that should be obvious. We're looking to see what was produced this year, not what was purchased this year, what was produced this year. So the purchase of used goods will not count towards GDP. The purchase of financial assets is not included. And if you stop to think for just a moment about that, it's pretty simple as to why. Stocks and bonds. We tend to associate stocks and bonds with the word investment. Don't do that here. This is not what investment means in this context. Investment is investment in capital goods, it's investment in research and development, technology, all these things that are used to produce other goods, or in residential construction. Financial assets, stocks and bonds in particular, when you purchase one of these, it's simply a transfer of ownership. Take a stock. If you purchase one share of stock in a company, that means you are incrementally here one percentage an owner. I don't mean 1 percentage point, but you are a small percentage owner of that company. It doesn't represent the production of a good or service. Therefore, it should not count towards GDP. It is merely a transfer of ownership of that stock from one to another. Same is true for bonds if it's on a secondary market. If it's on a primary market, if you're actually purchasing the bond from the issuer of the bond, you're merely lending your money. Again, that doesn't represent the production of a good or a service. That's why financial assets do not count, nor should they. Transfer payments, similar reason. Transfer payment is payment without the production of a good or a service. So once again, does not count, should not count. Now, here's where you get into some trouble, or where I should say GDP gets into a little bit of trouble. There's no counting of non-market activity. There's no counting of illegal activity. This is where topic 2.2 comes into play, the limitations of GDP. As GDP is currently calculated, there's no way to count non-market activity. It could be estimated. Economists have done this. It's fascinating to see what kind of research economists do in this category, how they would estimate the price of non-market activity or even illegal activity. But without a receipt, this is not going to be measured in, and this is taken as a limitation of GDP as a measure of economic performance for an economy. For example, let's say I like to cook, but let's say I'm a professional chef, and I go to work each day and I cook for people and I get paid for that. Okay, that will count. But what if I decide I'm going to make this nice big meal and I'm going to invite all my friends and family over, and of course I'm not charging them? What kind of person would I be then? That's non-market activity. But the question is, was that a productive activity? Of course it was, but there's no way to count that towards GDP. So all that went into that, all the effort that went into it and all that came from it would not be reflected in any measure of GDP, and that is considered a limitation. And I'm just using one example. You think about just basic work we all do just to maintain our homes, whether it's cleaning up or housework or fixing things up. That's all non-market activity. When you're doing it yourself, it does not count. Illegal activity, same thing. There are markets out there that are not legal. Money's changing hands for goods and services. It does not count towards GDP. Again, economists attempt to estimate these things, but officially there's no way to put those into the actual national income accounts. So in the context of AP Macro, it is important that you can recognize that and know that, like all indicators, this is not a perfect indicator. GDP is limited in terms of what it can and is able to accurately measure. Okay. All that said, let's go to the actual national accounts. This is from a spreadsheet from last year, 2019 data from the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis. And I simply show you this as an illustration to understand, again, what's counted, and also to expose you to this is the expenditures approach in action. This is how GDP is communicated. If you just simply go to bea.gov, you can look this stuff up all day. It's really interesting to see, but also looking at the numbers this way and running the numbers through your head and calculating them kind of makes GDP a little more real, so that you can understand the simplified versions that we're about to do, the practice examples. This is where they come from. This is what they're intending to reflect. So if you were to go through and for the top row of each category, which are color coded, add those up, you're going to get the total gross domestic product of because these numbers are in billions, $21.4 trillion. So that's adding up the personal consumption expenditures of 14.5, the gross private domestic investment of 3.7. Of course, subtracting net exports, that negative 631.9 indicates a trade deficit from last year. Imports are greater than exports. And of course, adding on to $3.7 trillion of government consumption, government purchases that is going on here. Note the subcategories, because that tells you what's counted. That can help you in understanding what is counted when you're doing these calculations in AP Macro. You've got goods and services, you've got durable versus non-durable goods. Investment spending is divided up between non-residential and residential, and then of course the change in private inventories. There's your imports and exports, and then sometimes we forget this as teachers. Even I forget sometimes to mention there's federal spending in government. There's also state and local government spending, which obviously must be included. So all of that added up is what gives us the overall GDP, in this case nominal GDP of the United States, or for any country for that matter. So with that in mind, let's look at just a practice example, purely hypothetical here, but this is the kind of thing that you can expect from AP. A lot of old FRQs are structured this way, where you're given hypothetical data about an economy, and using the expenditures approach, you've got to calculate GDP. So what do we need to do in order to answer this kind of question correctly? Well, it's essentially what you just did on the previous slide. Know your four components, know the four parts of the expenditures approach: C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Then identify C, I, G, and X on a table like this. After that, it's easy, just add them up. So going through, let's go item by item and ask ourselves, does it count? And if it counts, what does it count as? Household spending first, well, that's pretty easy. Household spending is consumption, that's consumer spending. Non-residential investment spending, we just saw that one, that's investment spending, so that's easy. Financial assets, that's the purchase of stocks, bonds, and other obviously financial assets. Well, we know that doesn't count, so scratch it, doesn't go anywhere. Exports, exported goods, $3,000. Yeah, that's part of net exports, counted. Intermediate goods of 2,500. No, scratch it, does not count. Don't bother with it. Residential investment spending, that's the construction of new homes, 2,500. Yeah, count it, that's investment spending. Don't forget that. That's another one that we easily confuse. It sounds like consumption. This is investment spending. Non-market activity, nope, can't count that. Transfer payments, can't count that. So scratch those two, they're out. Imports, they count. Net exports, but remember, that's a negative. We're going to subtract those. Government purchases, obviously, that's G, government purchases. And then additions to inventory, products that were produced but not sold, that's also part of investment spending. So again, just very sequentially go through each one. Does it count? And if it counts, what does it count as? And then once you've done all that, just add them up. And in this example, you would come up with a GDP of 19,000. Maybe those numbers are, maybe it's 19 billion. I didn't specify units. All right. So again, that's an example of how you could see that applied in a relatively simple way, but again, reflecting those real numbers that I showed you from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. All right, let's move on to unemployment. And the first part of topic 2.3 says we need to define the labor force, define the unemployment rate, and the labor force participation rate. Let's look at it in the context of your AP macro curriculum first, and then we'll get into it in a little more detail and talk about the reality some. So the unemployment rate's the percentage of the labor force that's out of work. I really like to hit that definition really hard. And in my class, we talk about it for a while because, again, this is a misperception. A lot of people who maybe didn't take economics or just don't have the background to know it, they see the unemployment rate and they assume it's a percentage of the total population. And that's obviously not true. It's a percentage of the labor force. So one of the first things we have to do, as it says here, is we have to define the labor force. Who counts, who doesn't count, because it's not the entire population. It's a I don't want to say small percentage. It's not. It's a bulk of it, but it's not the entire population. In our country, in the US, it's typically about half of the total population when you start looking at the numbers. We'll look at those actual numbers in a moment. The labor force participation rate is another measure of labor market activity. Labor force participation rate is the percentage of the adult population that's in the labor force. And again, let's be more specific. It's not just the adult population, adult meaning 16 and over. It's the eligible adult population if you really want to get specific. And again, we'll come back to that shortly and talk about what that means. So know what you're looking at. Unemployment rate, that's saying of the labor force, how many are out of work and looking for work. Labor force participation rate, of all those who could be in the labor force, how many of them actually are? That's what that term is actually attempting to tell you. Again, if we're going to work with indicators, we have to know what they represent. That's what those two represent. The next thing we should be able to do after we look at those numbers, we should be able to explain how changes in employment and the labor market affect the unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. This is going to be relatively intuitive. And then we should be able to calculate those two numbers. So we're going to do that as well today. But first, again, let's dive a little deeper into the meaning of unemployment and what it means. I want to define a few more terms. The labor force itself. One way of defining it is simply as the sum of the employed and the unemployed. And we're going to look at questions where you have a set of data and you have to calculate the labor force. And typically, this is the easiest way to consider it. How many people are employed? How many people are unemployed? Let's define those two. To be employed means you have a job, people currently holding a job. But let's make sure we understand there's no distinction between full-time and part-time employment in this definition. If you have a job, you're employed. It could be that you're underemployed. That doesn't get reflected in the unemployment rate. You could say that's a limitation of it. Regardless, as long as someone has a job, they are considered employed in this context. So again, there are going to be limitations here. These are not perfect indicators. The important part is that we know what we're looking at and understand what the numbers represent. Unemployed, to be unemployed means that you're actively looking for work, but you're not currently employed. Implied in that is that you're part of the labor force. And again, I'm going to come back to that shortly. If you don't have a job and you have no desire for a job, you're not considered unemployed. That's the most straightforward way to put that. The labor force participation rate, as we said, that's the percentage of the eligible population age 16 and over in the labor force, and the unemployment rate, percentage of total number of people in the labor force who are currently unemployed. So again, know your definitions first, know your terminology, be able to speak the language before diving into the numbers and trying to calculate these things. Because if you don't know what the numbers represent, they're just numbers. They don't have any meaning to them. And we want these numbers to have a meaning. When you see them in a headline, when you see headlines about the unemployment rate, you want to have meaning to that and know what it means. And, at the very least, know it's not a percentage of the population, it's a percentage of the labor force. All right, so a little more detail on the labor force. This goes a little bit beyond AP Macro, but I think it's going to help you understand what we're doing in this course a little bit better. As I already said, I know I'm getting a little repetitive here. To be considered unemployed, you've got to first be part of the labor force. And I said there's an eligible population. So who's in that eligible population? First of all, civilian. All right, so that takes out a lot of people. Got to be civilian, not military. Non-institutionalized. Institutional, a lot of different institutions are included here, but if you're in prison, a mental institution, or even school, maybe you're not going to be considered part of the labor force. I'll talk about that maybe in a moment. 16 years of age or older, and willing and able to work. Again, as I just said, if you're not willing and able to work, then you won't be part of the labor force. Examples of those not included in the labor force. So of the following groups, there are individuals who may not have a job, but for certain reasons may not be included. And we're assuming all these are over the age of 16. Full-time students. You're a full-time student and you're 17 years old and you don't have a job, you're not in the labor force. Now, if you do have an afternoon job, a part-time job after school, then you are part of the labor force, obviously, because you are part-time employed. But a full-time student, high school, college, whatever, without a job, not included. A stay-at-home parent choosing to stay at home, not looking for employment, not looking for a job, not interested in a job, they're not going to be included in the labor force. Retired individual, not looking for a job, not interested in a job. Individual who's unable to work due to a physical disability, who cannot get a job or hold a job for that reason, not included. And then finally, this is the one that really gets the most attention: marginally attached workers, specifically discouraged workers, those being individuals that were out of work for quite some time and gave up that job search, are no longer looking for a job. They are not included in the labor force. So what does that mean? It means there are limitations on this number. The unemployment rate, as we define it and calculate it, understates how many people are out of work because it excludes discouraged workers. It doesn't account for part-time workers. It doesn't account for underemployed workers. Part-time workers may want to work full-time, but there's no way to reflect that in our current unemployment rate. I'm not saying this is a criticism. This is just what it is. It is a limitation. And again, if we're going to use this number, if we're going to refer to this number as a marker of economic activity, we need to understand what it measures and what it does not or cannot measure. And this is an indication of some things that it does not or cannot measure. So have that in the back of your mind as well. Let's look at some data and look at some calculations. So the labor force participation rate, how we calculate it. First of all, it's clearly right here. You take the number in the labor force, however many people that is, and divide it by that eligible population of 16 and over. And then, of course, because we're looking at percentages, multiply that ratio by 100. I've put here a chart from Fred St. Louis, showing you fluctuations in the labor force participation rate. And of course, what's so jarring is that gradual increase from the mid 1960s all the way up to about 2000. I really find that fascinating, and I find that as an illustration of how economic data can tell us a story. It tells us a story of things that are going on in the United States. And in this case, what appeared to be going on is that more people were entering the labor force. Those that were eligible prior to the mid 60s that maybe didn't have opportunities are now entering the labor force. It doesn't tell us if they had a job or not. That's not what this number does. It tells us that those opportunities just may have existed. And why did those opportunities come about because of the mid 60s? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that hopefully you've learned about in your history classes. Could it be a reflection of the civil rights era? Could it be a reflection of more women entering the workforce because opportunities existed? Maybe educational opportunities existed. It could potentially be that. By the same token, you have a sharp decline during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and we haven't really bounced back from that when you look at the data. Why is that happening? Why has that happened? Part of that has to do with baby boomers retiring. That age group segment of our population was hitting retirement age at about that time, but there could be structural reasons too that we can't necessarily explain at this point. So again, indicators are just that. They indicate what's happening in an economy and they tell a story. The same is true for unemployment. So the unemployment rate here, again, another graph from the Fred St. Louis database. The unemployment rate would be the number of unemployed workers as a fraction of the labor force, as a percentage of the labor force. So we take the number of unemployed workers, divide it by our labor force, multiply it by 100. Of course, this one looks like an EKG, as if you're reading someone's heart. But what we see here with the ups and downs, very, very clear that the ups that we see, the upward trends that continue to occur, correspond with those gray bars. And what do the gray bars represent? They represent recessions. So as you well know by now at this point in the course, every time there's a recession, unemployment's going to rise. That's normal. That's what's going to happen. It doesn't mean we like it, but that's what happens. And then gradually in the recovery phase after the recession, we start to see the decline in unemployment over time. So again, the numbers tell us a story, and we need to understand what those numbers represent in order to understand the story. And what we want as teachers, what I know your teacher wants, is for you to understand that story, to understand what's happening in the world around you, to have that economic literacy so that you can interpret what's happening and not have to rely on everyone else to tell you. Okay, let's do a little practice with this. And again, one thing I do like to do, like I did with GDP, let's look at the real data. So I pulled some data from the most recent jobs report. This came out the first week of the first Friday of every month is the Jobs Friday, as it's known. And we can look at that data and really see what's happening, at least a snapshot of what's happening, as long as, again, we know what the numbers represent. So we know that March was rather turbulent. These numbers will be updated at the end of April, beginning of May, and they may look a little different. But for now, this is what we see from February to March of 2020. What I want to look at is how we calculate the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. But again, first, let's know what we're looking at. So working our way down, the top row is the civilian non-institutional population. So that's the eligible population, those over 16 that are eligible to be in the labor force. So that eliminates a lot of people because we know the total population in the United States is around 330 million. So a lot of people are not counted as part of the eligible population. The civilian labor force is next. That's your 162 million. These numbers are in thousands. 162 million people. Yeah, which is, like I said, about half of our total population. So the next row, participation rate, that's the number we want to be able to calculate, labor force participation rate. So 62.7 is the current labor force participation rate. And where did that number come from? Remember your equation. I've got it here in the upper right-hand corner. It's your labor force right there divided by your population, your eligible population. And if you take a calculator and you plug those two numbers into your equation, you'll get your 62.7. Okay. I checked it before I did this just to make sure. Working your way down, employed, that tells us how many people are actually employed as of March, and that's 155 million. Employment population ratio, this is not a number that we work with in AP Macro, but it's a number that a lot of economists like. Again, it defines itself. It's the number employed of the total population, so 60%. And then how many people are unemployed? And that 7.1 million right there represents that. And then finally giving us an unemployment rate in March of 4.4%. Again, how is that number calculated? Top right-hand corner, I've got it for you. It's the number unemployed divided by the labor force. So 7.1 million divided by, again, that 162. And if you do that equation, you'll come up with the 4.4%. And then finally, at the bottom, we do have how many are not in the labor force. And in that last column, we'll tell you how much did those things change when we went from February to March. And of course, these numbers reflect how difficult a month it was this March. And yeah, that's where we are. So that said, we want to practice that a little bit. We want to kind of see how this would look like in a hypothetical example and the type of questions you would have to answer in AP Macro. So look at this. This is similar. It's not the same. It's not all the same data, but this is a similar format that AP Macro likes to use. A lot of econ courses like to use, where we've kind of simplified things a little bit. But again, you've got to work your way through the data to figure out how to calculate these two indicators. So we want to be able to calculate the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate from this set of information. You have employed part-time, employed full-time, frictionally, structurally, and cyclically unemployed. Haven't defined those yet, I know, but those are the three types of unemployment. And then you have your marginally attached workers as well. So three things we can take first. We need to know how many people are employed, how many are unemployed, and what is the total labor force. Looking at this data, we have 700,000 people employed. We have 100,000 unemployed, giving you a total labor force of 800,000. From that, it's pretty simple. We just plug into our formula. So for the labor force participation rate, I take my labor force of 800,000 divided by the million in the total eligible population, and we get a labor force participation rate of 80%. For the unemployment rate, I take how many are unemployed, 100,000, and divide it by that total labor force of 800,000, and that's going to give me an unemployment rate of 12.5%. Where again did those numbers come from? Again, employed, right here. The 550 plus 150 gives you 700. Unemployed, 50 plus 30 plus 20, that's going to give you 100,000. A total labor force of 800,000. 200,000, the marginally attached here, they are not included in the labor force. So we get an 80% labor force participation rate. All right, so again, that's just another example of how we can present and analyze that data. Going forward, our curriculum, our AP Macro curriculum, also asks us to define the types of unemployment, which we just took a glimpse at, and the natural rate of unemployment, which again, I know you know by now, so we're just going to review rather quickly and then explain the changes in those types of unemployment. As I just referenced in that example we did, there are three types of unemployment. There's frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment. As I've noted earlier, full-time, part-time employment, there is no difference there. They're both employed, and we don't make any distinction there. What do these terms mean? Frictional, think about friction, think about physics. There are a lot of, by the way, I haven't said this yet, but there's a lot of terms in economics that come from physics. This is one. Think about your physics class and what friction is. You're between two things, right? Well, if you're frictionally unemployed, you're between two jobs, or you're between work and some other condition that you were in. So you're searching for a job. That's frictional unemployment. Maybe you just finished school and you're seeking your first job. You're between two things. That's frictional. But it also implies that there are opportunities out there, that there's something out there. Maybe you left a job and you're seeking your first job out there, or not your first job, but you're seeking your next job, next best job out there. Structural unemployment means you don't necessarily have the skill set needed by employers right now. There are mismatches there between the job seekers and the jobs that are currently open. It implies that those that are seeking employment need to do something to brush up their skill set. Maybe they need some new training. Maybe they need a new skill that they can propose to employers in order to get themselves employed. Cyclical unemployment is the one that occurs because of recessions, essentially. A downturn in the business cycle, people aren't buying goods, aggregate demand is down. Of course, you wouldn't have heard that in Unit 2, but now we can say it that way. And as a result, people lose their jobs. A lot of what we're seeing right now is cyclical unemployment. What we're seeing currently, April 2020, is cyclical unemployment because we've shut things down. And as a result, people are losing their jobs. We can define that as the deviation between the actual rate of unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. And we can look at that more as we go. Obviously, that's something that you discussed back when we were doing the Phillips curve and looking at different points and how unemployment and the natural rate deviate at short-run equilibrium when there's an inflationary or recessionary gap. It's good to practice these. So a few examples of different types of unemployment. I've given you some different scenarios of individuals who might not be employed. And we want to identify what type of unemployment it is based upon the definitions we just did. So first one, Dwight voluntarily leaves his job at a regional paper company to seek employment at a big box office supply store. So Dwight, he's a successful salesman. He's done really well, but he thinks, you know what, I'm going to go do this other thing. So he's leaving his job, seeking it. He's between two things. That makes him frictionally unemployed for that time period where he's seeking a new job. Second one, a recent high school graduate lacks the skill set necessary considered for a desired job. Lacks the skill set. That's the key to this one. This individual does not have the skills that employers are looking for. That is defined as structural unemployment. A recession hits the economy, causing closure of an auto factory. 800 workers are laid off. So these workers, it's not that they couldn't do the job. It's not that they didn't have skills. It's not that they wanted to find a better job. It's just tough times. And the factory shuts down. They lose their jobs as a result. That is cyclical unemployment. George has an uncanny ability to repair 1970-style 8-track cassette players. You may not even know what an 8-track cassette player is. Frankly, I don't either. I've seen them, though. I never used them. No employer is willing to hire him because nobody listens to 8-track cassette players. So he has a skill set, but nobody's interested in a skill set. That makes him structurally unemployed. George needs to go get a new skill set. Elaine relocates. She lived in New York. She's moving to Chicago. She's going to leave her job and she's going to find a new job when she gets to Chicago. So once again, what is she? She's between two things. Elaine is frictionally unemployed. And then finally, one more. Retail store fires 10 employees due to persistently falling sales, lost to online shopping. So this brick and mortar store isn't doing so well. People are buying their goods online instead. As a result, people are losing their job. That's going to be cyclical unemployment. So again, just some basic examples so that we can identify them. That's not uncommon in AP Macro that you'd have to identify the different types of unemployment. Last thing, and I know you know this because even in the series of videos we've been doing the last couple of weeks, we've talked a good bit about this, in particular with the long-run Phillips curve. What is the natural rate of unemployment? A number of different ways to define it. The first one, unemployment rate that would occur when the economy operates at full employment levels of output. Remember, we're assuming at full employment that all resources are being utilized in their most productive capacity and their most efficient means. Well, that would mean we're at the natural rate of unemployment as well. It's equal to frictional plus structural unemployment. So when there's zero cyclical unemployment, we're at the natural rate. The actual is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Changes in labor force characteristics cause the natural rate to change. It does change. Some people are under the impression it never does. It does change. Of course, again, we talked about that when we talked about shifting the long run Phillips curve. So making those connections are very important. And finally, just because you may see this from time to time, it is sometimes referred to as NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. Again, it's at that point. I'm referring back to Phillips curve from Unit 5. I know that seems odd in a review video, but we've been there. It's at that point where we're at the natural rate of unemployment and the expected inflation rate, that long-term equilibrium on the Phillips curve model. Here again is the natural rate of unemployment from Fred St. Louis, and again, it does fluctuate, as you can see. This is the short-term version of it. Long-term doesn't quite look like this, but you can see how there was a pretty significant fluctuation there during and post Great Recession as a lot of changes took place in our economy. But again, it rapidly came down as we went into recovery mode. And I don't want to say rapidly, but it did come back down as we were in recovery. Okay, that was a lot, but it was a lot that you've already done. It was really refreshing your memory and hopefully maybe clarifying things a little bit. And I do find, for myself at least, it does become more clear as we've worked all the way through the content and we take a look back and remind ourselves of those early lessons we got in those first couple of units of AP Macro. Look at me, I'm getting nostalgic about the early units. I do it every time. Let's do some practice problems. Let's see how this can be applied or how it's been applied in previous AP exams. Going to mix up a couple different things. Going to do a few multiple choice, going to do sections of FRQs in here. And we'll just, again, go through them one at a time and see. But even the MCQs, the multiple choice questions, we're going to treat them like FRQs. So first one, for an economy consisting of households and businesses only, which of the following is consistent with the circular flow of income and production? So all we have are two sectors, households and businesses. What's true about the circular flow model? So just remind yourself, if I'm taking an exam and this comes up, I'm drawing it out on a sheet of paper on the side just because I want to see it, I want to visualize it. Well, what's true? Well, households are buying final goods in product markets. The firms are supplying them. They're producing them and supplying them. So households are demanders and the firms are suppliers. On the factor market, that's reversed. The households are suppliers of factors of production. The firms are going to be demanders of those factors of production, paying for the factors of production. So with that information in mind and just refreshing our memory, what could we look for here? Well, flipping through your answers, A through E, households answer A, households are producers of goods and services. Well, you can stop right there because that's not true. They're not producing goods and services in this context. B, households are users of resources. Well, in this context, no, they're not. C, households are suppliers of resources, consumers of goods and services. That sounds pretty good. D, businesses are users of taxes, households are sources of taxes. Well, we didn't even have a government sector in this example, so we can't go there. Businesses are suppliers of resources. No, not in this model, they are not. Consumers of goods and services, not in this model. Correct answer is going to be C. And again, visualize and go beyond visualization. Sketch it out. You know, have a quick sketch of the circular flow model to help you answer that question. All right, well, this is a short FRQ that I abbreviated just to look at the components of GDP and how it asks a question about nominal GDP. So here we have aggregate data for a country X in 2018. Question A asks you to calculate the nominal GDP in 2018 and show your work. It doesn't say which approach to use. So given the data you have here, you could use the expenditures approach or the income approach. So let's think about how you would do that in either case. Using the expenditures approach, you've got to identify the components of this expenditures approach, C, I, G, and X. So looking at the table up here, consumer spending right there, $1,000, that's part of the expenditures approach. Investment spending is your second at 300. Government spending of 400, that's going to count as well. And in net exports, we have a trade deficit. Net exports are negative 100. We put those together and we get $1.6 billion. But what if we went with the income approach? Rent, wages, interest, and profit. Rent was 175, wages 1,100, interest 125, profits 200. Add those up, and as you should, you get the same answer, $1.6 billion. So either approach would have been acceptable. You didn't have to do both, but you do have to show your work. Part B, explain why the income approach for calculating GDP yields the same value as the expenditures approach. use the circular flow here. This is the rubric answer. According to the circular flow model, total spending equals total income. And again, that's just, again, visualize the circular flow model, and that'll tell you why that's the correct answer. Okay, moving on. Another multiple choice question. Now we're talking limitations of GDP. Gross domestic product has been criticized as a measure of well-being because it fails to take into account which of the following. All right, important phrase here, criticized as a measure of well-being. There are a lot of things to criticize. As I said, it's an imperfect indicator. But now we're looking at well-being. So what were those limitations? We talked about non-market activity. Well, that doesn't really apply to well-being, but it's true. Keep it in the back of your mind, but it's not well-being. What else? Illegal activity. Yeah, but does that apply to well-being? Maybe not. I don't know. What are the limitations are there? What this is getting at, what this is referring to, is really a misinterpretation of what GDP is intended to do. And I said that early on. GDP is intended to measure production. It doesn't measure well-being. So what could measure well-being? Well, look at A, because that's your correct answer, the distribution of income. GDP tells us absolutely nothing about the distribution of income. If you did know that, you would have a better sense of a measure of well-being for a society, but you can't get that from GDP. Now, these others, look at the value of intermediate goods, for example. That can be a commonly missed answer because we know it doesn't measure those intermediate goods, but does that refer to the measure of well-being? It does not. Value of financial transactions, sale of used items, those aren't counted, but again, that doesn't reference measure of well-being. So be specific to the prompt here and make sure that your answer is consistent with that. This is a tough question here about unemployment. An increase in the labor force participation rate will, well, it's kind of hard to answer this one without seeing the options. But again, what does this mean? It means that of all those eligible to be in the labor force, there are now more people participating in labor markets, seeking jobs or actually employed. So what does that mean? Go ahead and jump to the end here. It means it makes it more difficult to reduce unemployment. You have a larger pool of potential workers, and because there's a larger pool of potential workers, it could be more difficult for policymakers, if they intend to go this route, to reduce unemployment. We're not saying that's a good or a bad thing. That's not the job of an economist. Remember, we take a positive approach, not normative. It just is. That's just the way it is. That's just numbers and the way numbers work. So with a larger labor force participation rate, it could be more difficult to reduce the unemployment rate. A couple more. Industry historically used employees with specific skills. If this industry experiences technological advances that require new skills, there'll most likely be, okay, so you had workers with a skill set that were producing a good. Now their skill set is no longer needed. That's what I'm taking from this. If their skill set is no longer needed, how is that going to affect things? Here's your answers. Which of these types of unemployment is related to a lack of a skill set or an unneeded skill set? That's your structural unemployment. So the answer is D. Another FRQ. Following table shows employment data for country Z's working age population. So they're telling us these are the eligible workers here. You've got 4,000 cyclically unemployed, 1,000 frictionally, 2,000 structurally, 63,000 have a job, and then there's 30,000 that are not even part of the labor force. Part A, calculate the unemployment rate for country Z, show your work. Well, how do we do that? Well, it's the number unemployed divided by the labor force. How many are unemployed? Well, 4,000 plus 2,000 plus 1,000, 7,000. What's the total labor force? That was employed plus unemployed. So that's 7,000 plus 63 is 70,000. We take 7,000 divided by 70,000 times 100, we get 10%. Calculate the labor force participation rate, show your work. Okay, we need the labor force. We already said that in part A, the labor force is 70,000. We're taking that as a percentage of the total population. So that means we include not in the labor force the 30,000. So 70,000 over 100,000, that's going to give us 70%. And then finally, C, is country Z currently producing at its potential real output? Explain. No, it is not. We know that because of the existence of cyclical unemployment. The first row on this table tells us there's 4,000 cyclically unemployed workers. If we're at the natural rate of unemployment, if we're at potential real output, there wouldn't be any cyclical unemployment. So in this case, there must be, with cyclical unemployment, we are not operating at our potential real output. We're not on the PPC, we're not on LRAS. We have, in this case, a recessionary gap. Another way of framing that is that the actual rate of unemployment is greater than the natural rate. And again, we know that from the data presented in the table. Okay, that brings us to the end. Debrief and summary. So these were the learning objectives and skills that we wanted to accomplish today. We did go through these, and I hope that it was a good refresher of what you did way back in Unit 2, and that, again, it made it more clear because you have a different perspective on things now. You have a much broader perspective on these indicators, on macroeconomics as a whole, and an indication of how we use indicators as markers of economic performance. That's all I have for today. I want to remind you again that if you are concerned about tech issues, if you're concerned about having the proper devices and tools that you need or connectivity to take your exam, please contact College Board at cb.org/tech. And that's all I have for today. So thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. I do believe that putting this extra time in is going to be beneficial for you, both on the exam and in real life as you keep up with the economy. And hope to see you again. Have a great day.